"Get away from her," the Korean Mafia boss whispered, and 100 guests fell silent. It was the kind of night that looked perfect from the outside. The Grand Hyatt in Seoul was lit up like something out of a dream. The 42nd floor banquet hall had been reserved for a private dinner. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, soft music playing in the background, and about 100 guests dressed in their best. On paper, it was a charity event, a fundraiser for a children's hospital, the kind of thing that gets a mention in newspapers and makes powerful men look generous. But the people in that room knew better. Every single one of them. The man who had organized this evening was Park Jin-ho, and Park Jin-ho was not a philanthropist. He was the head of the Goryeo Brotherhood, one of the most powerful crime organizations in South Korea. He had spent more than 2 decades quietly building his empire from the ground up, starting from nothing in the port city of Incheon, working his way up through the kind of world most people only see in movies. Loan operations, construction dealings, underground gambling, his network touched almost everything. And yet, if you looked at him that night, sitting at the head table in a perfectly tailored dark suit, you would never have guessed any of it. He looked calm, unbothered, like a man who had nothing to worry about. Which, in many ways, was the most frightening thing about him. People who had worked around Jin-ho for years would say the same thing when asked about him. It was never the shouting that scared you, it was the silence. He almost never raised his voice. He rarely made threats out loud. He didn't need to. Everyone in his world already knew what his silence meant. And on the nights when he did say something, something quiet, something barely above a whisper, that was when you needed to pay very close attention. Now, back to the banquet. Among the 100 guests that evening was a young woman named Seo-yeon. She was 26 years old, a medical student from Busan, and she had nothing to do with any of this. She wasn't part of the organization. She had no idea about the money, the politics, or the quiet war that was being played out around her. She was there simply because of the man sitting next to her, a man named Dong-wook. Dong-wook was one of Jin-ho's lieutenants, a mid-level guy. Not at the top, not at the bottom. He had been with the Brotherhood for years and had always managed to stay in good standing. He was the kind of man who knew how to smile at the right time, say the right things, and make people feel comfortable around him. He brought So-yeon along that night because, from the outside, this was just a dinner. A fancy one, sure, but just a dinner. What So-yeon didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Dong-wook had been stealing. Not small amounts, not mistakes. Deliberate, calculated theft from the Brotherhood's own operations. For nearly 2 years, money had been quietly disappearing from the Itaewon side of the network. A little here, a little there. The kind of skimming that is designed to go unnoticed. And for a while, it did, but not forever. Jin-ho had a man he trusted completely, a former military intelligence officer who went by the name Gray. That was all anyone called him, just Gray. For 3 months, Gray had been following the money trail, and after 3 months of careful, patient work, the trail ended in one place, Dong-wook. There was one more complication though. Some of the transfers, the ones used to move the stolen money, had been routed through a shell account, and that account was registered under So-yeon's name. Almost certainly, she had no idea. That was the most likely explanation. Someone had used her identity, her details, without her knowledge. But in the world Jin-ho operated in, that kind of explanation doesn't always matter. Being connected to stolen money, even by accident, even unknowingly, could put a person in a very dangerous position. Jin-ho knew all of this before he ever walked into that banquet hall. Here is the thing that most people miss when they hear this story. The banquet wasn't a celebration. It was a test. Every person on that guest list had been quietly looked into over the previous 6 months. Jin-ho had invited all of them on purpose, including Dong-wook, because he wanted to see how a guilty man behaves when he thinks he's safe. He wanted to watch. He wanted to read the room. And he already knew exactly what he was going to do before the first course was ever served. The evening started normally enough. People took their seats. The food came out. Conversation moved around the tables. Glasses were refilled. The band played something gentle in the corner. For anyone who didn't know better, it looked like a pleasant night. Then, at 9:47 in the evening, something shifted. Park Jin-ho set down his chopsticks. He stood up from the head table, buttoned the front of his jacket, and began to walk. Not toward Dong-wook. Not toward any of the other men in the room. He walked directly toward Seo-yeon. The room noticed immediately. That's the thing about a man like Jin-ho. When he moves, people watch. Conversations dropped off mid-sentence. The band slowed and then stopped. Waiters who had been moving between tables suddenly found reasons to stand still. 100 people who had been busy with their own dinners and their own conversations all turned, at almost exactly the same moment, to look at what was happening. Jin-ho reached Seo-yeon's table. He didn't make a scene. He didn't point fingers or raise his voice. He simply placed one hand lightly on the back of her chair, bent slightly at the waist, the way a person does when they want to say something that no one else is supposed to hear. And he spoke. 4 words. Get away from her. He wasn't talking to Seo-yeon. He was talking about her. And everyone in that room understood, even the ones who couldn't hear the exact words, that what had just happened was not small. Seo-yeon sat very still for a moment. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then she picked up her clutch from the table, pushed her chair back, and stood up. She didn't look at Dong-wook. She didn't say anything. She walked toward the elevator, and 2 of Jin-ho's men, who seemed to appear from nowhere, walked on either side of her, not touching her, just present, guiding her out. She wasn't being dragged away or forced, but she also wasn't leaving alone. She walked out of the banquet hall and didn't look back once. Dong-wook didn't move. He sat in his chair with his hands on the table and his eyes straight ahead. He didn't stand up. He didn't call out after her. He didn't ask Jin-ho what was happening. He just sat there, completely frozen, while the room around him stayed completely silent. Jin-ho walked back to the head table. He sat down. He picked up his chopsticks again and continued eating. The band did not start playing again for 11 minutes. Nobody got up to leave. Nobody asked a question out loud. Nobody wanted to be the person who said the wrong thing in that moment. The silence just sat there, heavy and thick, over the whole room. And in that silence, every single person at that dinner understood something that didn't need to be explained. The man at the head of this table already knew everything. He had known all evening, and now, in the quietest, most controlled way imaginable, he had made his move. Seo-yeon was taken to a hotel in Mapo-gu that same night. She was told she was safe, that she could leave Seoul in the morning, and that no one would bother her. She did leave. She went back to Busan and eventually finished her medical studies. 3 years later, she sat down with an investigative journalist and gave a careful, measured interview. She confirmed one thing clearly. She believed that Whisper had saved her life. She didn't go into detail about why she believed that. She didn't have to. Anyone who understood the situation already knew. Dong-wook was gone by the next morning. His phone was left sitting on the kitchen counter of his apartment in Gangnam. His car was found near the port at Incheon, the same city where Jin-ho had started out decades earlier, which might have been a coincidence, but probably wasn't. South Korean crime investigators who later studied the case noted in their files that Dong-wook had almost certainly been removed from the organization in the days following that dinner. What exactly happened to him is not publicly confirmed. His name simply stopped appearing anywhere after that night. Park Jin-ho ran his organization for a few more years after that evening. He was eventually arrested in 2014, not directly for anything connected to the banquet, but for other activities tied to his construction operations. Prosecutors who built the case against him had specifically studied that night at the Grand Hyatt as an example of how he maintained control. Not through open violence, not through intimidation that anyone could point to in a court of law, but through ceremony, through silence, through the very careful use of a moment in front of witnesses who all knew exactly what they were seeing and would never say a word about it publicly. He was convicted. He received a 17-year sentence and was sent to Seoul Detention Center. The 100 people who were in that room that night, the guests, the waitstaff, the musicians, almost none of them ever spoke about it openly. What is known about the details comes from 3 places. Seo-yeon's 2012 interview, documents from the prosecution's case file that were partially released, and the account of one insider who cooperated with investigators under a protected identity. All 3 of those sources describe the same moment the same way. They agree on the words. They agree on the silence that followed. They agree on what Dong-wook did and didn't do when it happened. What they don't agree on, what no one has ever been able to confirm, is whether Park Jin-ho already knew, when he stood up from that table and walked across the room, that Dong-wook would not be alive by the end of the week. Whether the whisper was a mercy shown to an innocent woman, or whether it was the last move in a plan that had been set in motion months before any of them sat down to dinner. Maybe both things are true. Maybe that's the point. The most dangerous people are rarely the ones who make the most noise. They're the ones who never need to. Who can walk across a room, say 4 words so quietly that only one person hears them, and leave 100 others too afraid to move for 11 minutes? That is what happened on the 42nd floor of the Grand Hyatt in Seoul, in the autumn of 2009. A whisper, a walk to the elevator, and a silence that no one in that room ever forgot.